The wind on the mountaintop smelled of iron and thistle and the clean, empty cold of places that did not remember laughter. The slope was steep with scree where men had stamped and slid and bled. A bare-armed pine rattled its needles like dry bones. A falcon traced slow circles above the rocks, patient as time. He woke to the taste of coin in his mouth and the feel of stone at his back. His breath went in as a ragged rasp and came out white. The sky was a hard, bright blue that had no mercy in it. When he tried to roll, his body answered with a chorus of pains, each voice sharp and certain about where he had been cut. He lay still and listened to the mountain. Wind, the falcon, a horse somewhere downslope, stamping. The brittle conversation of armor being lifted from another man's limbs. The low murmur of two voices not his own. "I am not a crow to peck at a corpse," the first said, and he knew that voice. Northman had a gloom that lived in the throat. This one had a stillness as well. "He breathes." "I," said the second, reed thin and light, barely a voice at all. "The wind refuses him. There is a thing in that." Arthur Dayne opened his eyes. Two men stood over him, their shadows thrown long by the unpitying sun. One wore gray leather stained dark with sweat and blood, his hair the blue-black of a river at night. His face set as if some mason had carved the lines long before the man had grown into them. The other was small and lean, eyes too wide, clothing of greens and browns that wanted to become the mountain itself. "Eddard Stark," Arthur said, and the taste of coin in his mouth became words that stuck. He saw his sword, Dawn, on the stones not a yard away, stripped of his blood and someone else's. It had not broken. It never had. The sight of it was a balm and a wound. "We are beyond names," said the man in gray. But then his eyes lowered, as if he could not stand to look upon the dead that lay scattered. He spoke more softly. "Here we are simply men." Arthur looked past them. The tower stood, square and featureless in the sky. It was smaller than he remembered when he had first come to it, when it had seemed like a thing born of silence and dust. The door was open. Inside, the air had been thick with heat and herbs and the sighing of a woman who had tried to be brave longer than any mortal could hope to be. Luana Stark. He closed his eyes to her name, because even thinking it felt like stepping barefoot onto a blade. "If you bring me to the sept," he began, but the words fell apart. There was no sept here, only rock and sky and the memory of three men in white who had stood between a wolf of the north and a promise. "We brought you to breath. That is all," said Eddard. He crouched, and the sound of leather creaked. His face was young, younger than the weight in him, and tired beyond it. "My sister asked for mercy for the child. She did not speak your name, but you were the last man between me and a door I had to open. There is no honor in killing what the mountain has already spared." Arthur's hand moved, inch by inch, until his fingers brushed the stony warmth of Dawn's hilt. He felt the old quiet that came with it, the surety of a blade made for one purpose and nothing else. He did not lift it. The falcon spiraled. A small fly landed on his lip and walked there until the wind took it. "You are not a man to leave debts," Arthur said, staring up at the endless blue. "If you let me rise, I will owe you." "Ned," said the reed-voiced man, "men take debts away from one place and pay them in another. We know the price of that." Eddard's silence lasted a long breath. Then he stood, as if something in him had already made its choice. "You may rise," he said, "if you can." The voice of old training spoke through Arthur's flesh. He rolled to one side in a controlled movement that kept his wounds from tearing, pushed against rock, and found himself on his knees. He mastered the dizziness and bent his head until it cleared. Dawn leaned against him, white as a winter morning, unmarked by blood or sun. He used it like a crutch to stand, then held it upright, the point in the scree. "I yield," he said aloud, with the formal cadence that had been taught to him when he was a boy at Starfall. "My life is yours." "I do not want your life," Eddard said. "That is fortunate," Arthur replied, a ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth surprising even himself. "I am told it is of little practical use." The reed-thin one laughed, no more than a breath with warmth in it. Howland, Eddard said to him, and the small man tilted his head, listening to something that was not the wind. You said the child, Arthur murmured. The taste in his mouth was not coin but ash now. Is the child alive? Eddard said, his voice like the gray of his eyes, and hidden from the world, which is, for now, the same thing. Arthur closed his eyes again, relief as sharp as grief. The woman in the tower had gripped his hand long enough to leave marks from her nails. She had begged in the quiet voice of someone whose throat was dry. She had said words Arthur had no right to hear, and yet she had spoken them to him because there were so few breaths left for her to waste. Now the mountain's air moved through him, and he felt the shape of the vow. He had not yet spoken but had already been living since he had come north to guard a door for a doomed hope. Then this is what I ask, he said, and it was strange, even to his own ears, to ask anything of a man who had defeated him. Give me leave to return home. There is a sword I must put to rest. After that, let me come to your hall as no man, clad in no color, named by no lord. Let me be a shadow among your shadows, and let me teach the boy to live past winter. Eddard did not answer at once. His silence had weight. Arthur felt the ache of every cut and the older ache of the white cloak he had fallen out of by living. The falcon drifted farther away, Ard the sun. There are those who will never forgive you, Eddard said finally. There are those who will never forgive me, but my sister left me with the cost of secrets, and I have paid more coin than I own. If you come, you will be a sword I cannot show to anyone. And when you speak to the boy, you will not speak of his birth. I will speak of the other births instead, Arthur said softly, of the daily one that makes a man of a boy and asks him to choose the knife at his own throat again and again, of what a blade becomes when it ceases to be a piece of steel. The reed-thin man looked at him, eyes as green as crushed herbs. Words are a kind of weather, Howland said, as if to himself. Sometimes they only pass. Sometimes they change seasons. Return your blade, Eddard said. Then return to the north. I will find you work that suits a man who has no name. Arthur bowed like a dusty pilgrim. He slid Dawn into the scabbard, feeling the faint hum in his bones that had first made him weep when he was 14 and the old men at Starfall had laid the pale steel in his hands. He turned without ceremony toward the long road that reached out of the mountain and downward into valleys where water moved and men forgot their dead in order to build fires and bake bread. He did not look back at the tower. The journey to Starfall was a thing of dust and silence. In the nights he camped beneath the wide bowl of the sky and counted the scars on his body, as if they were constellations no other man would ever learn. He passed a wagon of potters, with bowls clinking like the voices of children. He passed a shepherd boy who stared at the sword at his side with big, wet eyes and then offered him a broken fig with his small brown hand. In a village he bought soap and a length of linen and the crisp apples of a late drying tree. He cleaned himself until the sores stung and wrapped his wounds anew. He did not speak his name to anyone. Names are a net and he had to swim. When he crested the rise above Starfall, the castle crouched like a white cat on its rock, the sea at its back. The river that came down from the mountains sent its foam singing against the stones, and the waterfall threw a long veil in the sunlight. The cliff face held the mouth of the caves where the Danes believed their first fathers had found the pale stone that drank the dawn. He stood and watched the spray drift and thought of all the young men who had put their hands to that cave's damp walls and whispered supplications. He had been one of them. Now he went down the path without touching it. He did not enter by the gate, but by a gardener's sally with ivy grown over its hinges. In the yard, a handful of men were at their drills. He knew their movements at a glance, the ways their shoulders lifted, the flaw in a hip, the surety of a foot. The master-at-arms was a barrel-chested man whose voice boomed like a drum. He did not turn his head when Arthur moved past in a plain brown cloak. Within the castle, he walked halls he had known as a boy. Each shadow was a cup that held memories. He passed a window where he had once stood with his sister to watch rain. It had made the courtyard a mirror. He went to the armory. The keeper there was new to him, a woman with strong wrists and a narrow mouth. "We are closed," she said, not looking up from the leather she was tending. "I will not be long," Arthur said, and the tone in his voice reached inside her habits and moved something. She looked up, saw his face, and swallowed. "My lord." "I am no lord," he answered. "Where is the chest?" She understood without asking. She led him to a long room at the back where the lanterns felt like stars brought too close. The chest was low and plain, iron-banded, old enough that his grandfather had been a boy when the carpenter had wedged its corners. He knelt and lifted the lid. The gloom breathed out. He took the white cloak folded inside and set it gently on the floor. He ran a hand over it, feeling the places where it had been mended. He could remember the long, thin needle in Ashara's fingers, the thread she had licked and pinched. He set the cloak aside and reached for the sheath of the blade. Dawn lay like a sliver of frost in the dark. He held it for a while. The sword knew his hands. He thought of all the things they had told him when he had knelt to receive it, that a true blade must be held in a true heart, that a man was a scabbard. How simple and neat it had sounded. Then, as if the world could be bound with a ribbon. "At peace," he told the steel. "For a while. Find a dream that suits you." He laid Dawn inside the chest and drew the cloth over it like a blanket. The breath that left him felt like a farewell to more years than he had counted. He rose, took the white cloak, folded it again, and placed it on top. He closed the lid and sealed it with a key he wore on a thong about his neck. Then he pulled the thong off and laid it on the chest as if it were the last small coin owed to a ferryman. "I will use something more honest," he told the armorer. "What is more honest than that?" The woman asked, not to challenge but because she desired to understand. "A blade that has forgotten its name," Arthur said. He took a short, good steel from the rack, its edge competent, its hilt wrapped in worn leather. He weighed it, felt the balance. It was not magic. It would accept what he asked of it and complain only within reason. "This will do." He left Starfall before sunset in order not to see the white walls take the peach-pink blush they wore when the sky threw its last kindness upon them. He did not want to be seduced. The road north was a band drawn across the land. He set his feet to it and did not look back. Time became a braid. Days laid themselves like straw, small and many, and he moved through them until they warmed into one narrow mattress of travel on which he slept. He went through small towns that smelled of cumin and pea and vinegar. He crossed a river where the ferry was a plank and a man with arms corded like rope. In a market he bought a black felt cap and wore it low so it shadowed the lines of his face that men recognized before they remembered why. Children stared at him and then forgot him as soon as a stray dog trotted by. The world is kind to those who have no need of notice. He worked for a farmer for a week in exchange for oats and stew and a dry place to lie. Each evening, he practiced with the short sword in the barn while the old mare watched him with soft brown eyes and chewed. The air smelled of hay and old leather and the sweet, faint smell of apples that had fallen beyond saving. He taught the farmer's slow cousin how to keep his left shoulder down when he pulled a scythe toward him and not slice his own shin. He taught the farmer's girl how to twist a rope end so it would not whip back and strike her face. He did not speak of swordplay. It all felt like swordplay. Everything a hand does teaches the hand how to do other things. When he reached the neck, the air took on the scent of water that had lost its patience, of peat and rot that was not decay so much as the world building itself in another form. The reeds whispered and the mosquitoes whined. He met a small man in a flatboat whose eyes he knew at once. "You kept your word," said Howland Reed. He smiled a narrow smile and tapped the boat. "Get in, Sir No Name." "And you kept your counsel," Arthur answered, stepping in without rocking the craft. He sat cross-legged, and the water slid under them as Howland set his pole. They moved through the green labyrinth in silence. There was a frog making a heroic sound somewhere near, and the rushes rubbed at each other like cats. "You will not say it," Howland said at last, as if he were prodding a fish to see if it would leap. "But you loved the boy's mother." Arthur watched a dragonfly hum along the top of the water. Its wings slashed blue and green, its life brief and intense. "No," he said, "and yes, I loved what she dared to risk of herself. She was a bell that rang true, though the hand that held the rope had its own reasons. We spoke once of what it costs to be what others imagine when they look at you. She understood the weight of legend against a breastbone. She laughed when the sound of her own name surprised her in the air, as if it could be a bird after all and not a chain. But love is a strong word that men wrap around wishful thinking and cruelty alike. I loved my duty, and the line between that and the rest was not always where I thought it would be. Howland nodded, satisfied not by the words but by the way they had been said. You are a man who does not flee from weather, he said. Eddard will be glad of that. Eddard is a man who stands in weather until it goes through him, Arthur replied. The land gave way gradually to firmer soil, to the first trees with needles that smelled like a promise of winter. They drew the boat up onto a bank and parted as if they had been neighbors who had shared bread for years instead of men who had shared one grim morning. Howland vanished into the reeds in 3 steps, and Arthur walked north with his cap low and the short blade hanging at his hip. Winterfell rose from the land like a thing grown there rather than built. The walls looked as if they had decided to be walls after spending years as cliffs. The towers were not elegant, but they were certain. Smoke went up from 6 chimneys into the cold sky and was taken in without a ripple. He crossed the drawbridge over the green-black moat and entered the great yard. Hammering rang from a forge. Some woman's laughter drifted like linen hung and forgotten. The barking of dogs ran like staccato. A gray man with a broad nose and whiskers like frost stood near the armory door, watching a boy and a taller boy trade blows with blunted swords. The smaller one was quick with his feet and tired at once in his arm, too much back, not enough legs. The taller one was proud of his reach and forgot his hips. Arthur watched, hands clasped behind his back, and did not say a word. He had learned that men who watched too closely became part of the thing they watched simply by the weight of their intention. The boys spent themselves and laughed with the rough gasping that comes at the end of practice between those who do not yet imagine death as anything but a heavier kind of breathlessness. The graying man turned toward Arthur. "You've the look of a swordman about you," he said, eyes short and assessing under brows that met like a thatch. "I am fit to teach men how to keep their feet," Arthur said. The man's whiskers twitched. "We have a master at arms. Perhaps he will have you show the boys a step we are slow to learn." "And perhaps he will not," Arthur replied. He kept his voice humble but plain. "I ask for board and meat and work to make my keep. I ask for a place without questions. And if there is a boy who needs a certain kind of learning, I ask to be the man to give it." "Who sent you?" the gray man asked, as if it were a question he had to say. "The road," Arthur said. They stood and faced each other in the yard. A dog scampered past with a scrap of cloth. Somewhere, someone struck steel on steel in time with a song only that person could hear. The man looked at Arthur's hands and the way he stood and the quiet that had come to live in his eyes. "The lord of the castle sees certain men," the gray man said finally. "You may be one of them, or you may be none. Wait." Arthur waited. He watched the boy with the quick feet attempt exactly the wrong parry and take a whack across the shoulder for it. He winced and grinned at once. One of those boys whose body enjoyed learning even when his pride did not. The taller boy offered a hand to pull him up. The smaller one took it, sprang to his feet, and stood too close, squinting up at the taller with fierce affection. A guard returned. With a quiet nod, Arthur was led through the chill tunnel of a tower's lower belly and up a stair that smelled of ink and iron and old smoke. In a room that held a long table and maps weighted with river stones, Eddard Stark stood near a window, looking out at his own land as if he were trying to see what it would become in a month of hard weather. He turned when Arthur entered, and the only thing that moved in his face was the small, unremarkable point of light that comes to a man's eyes when he sees something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. "You came," Eddard said. "I told you I would," Arthur answered. They stood like men who had just met and like men who had met 1,000 times in 1,000 uneasy dreams. Eddard gestured to the bench, then did not sit himself until Arthur had sat. There were cups on the table that a servant filled with a dark ale that smelled of baked grain and apples. Eddard drank, wiped the foam from his lip with the side of his hand in a gesture that seemed honed down to itself by years. "There is a boy," Eddard said, and the sound of the word carried a tenderness that did not soften him so much as temper him. "He is my son. He is not my son. The world will make of that a puzzle to gnaw on until its nose bleeds. I would rather it gnaw on bones. He must become a man ahead of the schedule winter would usually demand of him. He must learn the edge of the thing that is not his and hold it without bleeding from it. He must stand where men can see him without being seen. Can you teach a boy that?" "I can teach a boy how to move without lying to him," Arthur said, "and how to put his breath where his feet will not fail him. The rest is the business of a boy's soul. Some come into the world with a knife in their fist and spend their lives learning to unclench the fingers. Some come with both hands open and learn to hold. I will show him what belongs to craft. I will not show him lies, even when they dress as kindness." Eddard listened in that way that made silence into a place one could enter like a house. He turned the cup in his hand, as if the wood's grain could tell him where true north lay. "There is another thing," he said. "The south makes knights. The north remembers oaths and trees. In my hall there are men with Southron names and Southron habits. I have no use for their vanity, but I have use for their skill sometimes. What you teach the boy, if there is to be a name for it, it must be a name that does not belong to the seven. My gods do not require a septon's touch to make a man true." "Knighthood is a word," Arthur said. "It is also a story men tell themselves at night to make sleep sweeter. But there is a thing beneath the word and beneath the story. A man may be a blade for a king or a door for a child. If you will have it, I will teach him a way that belongs first to bread and then to steel. I will teach him to put his hand between the world and anything that still remembers how to be small." "Bread before steel," Eddard repeated, as if tasting the order. "Yes, that is the north, when it remembers itself." He took a small cloth pouch from under a ledger and set it on the table. It made a flat sound. Arthur did not touch it. "If I take coin from you," he said, "I become what men say. A hireling with a good blade is a useful thing and a cheap thing and a disposable thing. If I do not take coin, the kitchen must feed me anyway and the bed must be made. You will have to answer questions." Eddard smiled, a winter smile, quick and thin as the sun in the short months. "I answer questions by listening to them pass," he said. "I will give you a warm place in the outer keep and the right to come and go by the east gate. You will not wear a house's color. If anyone asks your name, you will tell him the first thing your eyes fall upon when you open them in the morning. That will do to keep their tongues from knowing what their hearts already fear to say." Arthur inclined his head. "Then let me begin." The boy came to him at dusk in the small practice yard beyond the kennels, where the air was busy with the layered smells of straw, damp fur, and the faint last sunlight washing the stone. He came alone, though Arthur had the prickling sense of eyes on the back of his neck. Wolves, likely, or a brother peering through a curtain with the delicate speed of affection that cannot keep its own counsel. The boy wore a thick shirt and had a wooden waster tucked under his arm. He was all awkwardness and angles, that age when the bones think themselves longer than they are, and the knees do not yet belong to the legs. His hair was dark and his eyes were the gray that comes before snow. He stopped, tried to look braver than he felt, and then gave up the pretense in a visible breath. "My lord," he said, because no one had told him not to. "I am not a lord," Arthur replied. "I am a man who will tell you to stand one way and not another, and you will listen, and you will swear at me in your heart, and then you will love me for being right, and then you will hate me for being right, and then you will forget me." "What is your name?" "John," the boy said, and his chin lifted half an inch as if he expected the world to do something cruel to it. "John Snow." Arthur nodded. The name settled inside him like a pebble dropped into a well, ringing once. "Life is a pair of boots you walk out of by the time they fit," he said. "Let's teach your feet anyway. Put the wooden blade down." John hesitated, then obeyed. Arthur stepped close enough to smell the boy. Sweat and wool and the sweet, slight scent of a boy's scalp when his hair has been under a cap all day. He put a hand on John's sternum and a hand on his lower back. "Breathe," Arthur said, "but do not let the breath only live up here where it makes a bird of you. Put it down into the belly. Make it heavy." Again, again, they breathed. The sky used up the last of its color like a careful woman taking the final crumbs of bread to make a thin pudding. A dog barked once and fell quiet, sighed, circled in straw. Arthur stepped back. "Stand with your feet under you," he said. "It sounds simple, and it is, but you have been standing wrong your whole life because you thought standing was something the top of you did, while the bottom went along out of politeness. Heels under hips, knees soft, never locked, toes feel the earth. Your toes know where north is better than any map." "Good." John made the adjustment. It was a small thing and a great thing. Arthur felt the satisfaction he had loved since he was young. The click as a movement found its hinge. He walked around the boy and nudged him here and there, making small corrections as if folding a blanket square. "When you hold a blade," Arthur said, "you do not hold a blade. You hold a question. A blade is what other men see. You will not show them your question if you can help it. You will learn to live with the answer in your bones. Pick up the waster." John did as he was told. Arthur showed him how to grip it, not too tight, or the blade would tremble with the fatigue in his forearm. Not too loose, or he would lose what he thought he had. He guided John through a simple cut and then another. They did not strike anything. The air received the strokes and made no comment. John's face tightened and loosened, as young faces do when the body is learning and the mind is doing 6 kinds of arithmetic at once. "You will learn 8 things," Arthur said, his voice deliberate as the ticks of a careful clock. 8 things that are not separate, though I will name them one by one because that is how a mind eats. Watch, listen, learn, serve, shield, speak truth, seek mercy, stand last. They are not the only things a man may be, and they do not spare you from choosing wrong, but they will keep your feet under you when the ground goes away. Say them." John said them, a little shyly, the words clumsy in his boy's mouth. He looked up when he came to the end, as if expecting to be told he had said them badly. Arthur gave him a short nod that meant both well and again. "Again," Arthur said, and John said them again slower. On the 3rd time, the boy's voice found something inside the words and rested there. "What does stand last mean?" John asked then, unable to carry a question past his tongue. "It sounds like losing. It sounds like choosing," Arthur replied. The light had thinned to what country people call candle time. "There will be days when men you love would be safer if you let them go before you into the dark. There will be days when glory is a bright thing at the front and duty is a winter at your back. You will stand where you are needed. Often that will mean letting others stand first. The last man holds the door. The last man turns to make certain no one is left behind. The last man knows that keeping himself is what makes him of any use at all." John considered, and the hooks of his quick mind caught almost every word. "And speak truth," he pressed, "even when it hurts?" "Especially when it hurts," Arthur said. "But there is a way to speak truth that builds a man and not merely cuts him. You will learn the difference. Swords tell truths. That is their business. But the cleanest cut is not always useful. Take care where you put your edge." They practiced until the sky had decided on darkness. Arthur sent John to his meat and his sleep with a last long look, the kind a craftsman gives a piece of wood that will one day be a harp. The boy went, shoulders set with the fatigue that makes sleep sweet, and Arthur remained standing, listening to the small sounds a yard keeps in its pockets. In the nights that followed, the lessons built themselves like a wall laid by a careful mason. John's feet began to understand without needing to be told where the weight should live. His shoulders relaxed until the blade moved by itself, the way a thought becomes a hand. Arthur taught him to listen to the difference between the thunk of wood on wood and the small whisper of an advance that meant trouble. He taught him how to tie a bandage in 4 heartbeats with his teeth involved and his patience left on the floor. He taught him how to draw water at dawn without waking a dog, how to lift a sleepy child in armor without breaking the child's sleep or the man's back, how to recognize when a young boy's anger wanted to be a lesson and when it wanted to be a cry. He began to teach other children as well by not teaching them, Arya Stark wandered in the way smoke does when a window is half open. She picked up a stick and watched with the ferocity of a hawk at the edge of a field. Arthur let her stand where she wanted. He never looked directly at her. He spoke into the air around her. "Short blade, long step," he would say, as if remarking to himself. If a tall man makes himself long with his arm, make yourself longer with your legs. Arya's stick would flash, too wild, and then again more like the thing he'd said. She would glance, quick as a fox, to see if he had seen. He did not smile at her. It would have made her distrust him, because she trusted praise only when it had been torn from the earth like a stubborn root. Robb Stark came sometimes, bright and good at being admired, his laugh like a bell. He enjoyed the feel of the blade in his hands and listened to correction with dignity. He learned quickly and forgot a quarter of what he had learned equally quickly when pride came to sit on his shoulder again like a tame hawk. He will be a captain men love, Arthur thought, watching him, if he lives long enough to learn what being loved does not give you. The youngest boys watched with reverence and fell asleep on benches with their mouths open. The girls came and went, most of them rolling their eyes at any very long instruction, and then remembering of their own accord the 3 bits that mattered. Arthur taught them how to fall without making a sound and how to turn a pot's heavy lid into a shield. This is not knighthood, he would say to himself, pleased to feel the word become smaller in his mind. This is firewood stacked in a dry shed. This is jars of beans put away. This is making sure the old dog's paws are clean so he does not carry in the mud. He never told anyone his name. The men in the yard called him the Brown Man, or the Quiet Blade, or the one who stands wrong until you see he stands right. The kitchen women called him Sweet Eyes, without malice, because he said please as if it were a coin he valued, and because he cut bread with a respect that had no mockery in it. The children called him Nothing. They tugged on his sleeve when they needed him and spoke to him in the half-formed grammar children use with those they trust to hear sense under the slurry. Eddard watched, sometimes, from a balcony above the yard where the rhyme came first on cold mornings. He would cross his arms and let his weight lean on the stone and wear that expression that a leader wears when he has given a decision permission to exist long enough to show him whether it is good. He never interfered, not once, not even when Arthur had John sit for half a day in the snow holding a rock in each palm to learn the way the mind lies about what is impossible. Men muttered, but softly. Eddard's silence was license, and Winterfell took its tone from the man who had married it. One night when the moon lay down on its side like a cut throat, John came to Arthur with a thing in his hands wrapped in cloth. "I made this," he said, shy and proud as a young dog bringing a stick. He opened the cloth to show a small leather book stitched with awkward care, the edges of the pages uneven, the cover stamped with a crooked star he had banged into it using a nail and a hammer. "What have you written?" Arthur asked, careful not to touch it. He believed men should hold their own work while they spoke of it. It kept truth from evaporating in the heat of admiration. "Words," John said, and flushed at once at the smallness of it. "Your 8 things, and thoughts, about what they look like. I know I'm not to be a knight. I know that word is for men who kneel to the 7 and the songs. But I thought," he swallowed, "I thought names are only boxes to keep bread dry. I thought maybe bread doesn't care what you call the box." Arthur smiled then, slow because the smile, like any fine thing, could be broken if handled roughly. "Bread never cared," he said. "Open your book." John opened it and read his crooked lines by the light of a single candle. "Watch, the world changes when you look at it, but it also tells on itself to anyone who knows what tired wheels sound like. Listen, the mouth is impatient and the ear is steady. Learn. Even when pride drags its feet, make it walk. Serve. Hands have more uses than they boast. Shield. The best blows you will ever strike are the ones that never had to be struck because you stood where they could not be thrown. Speak truth. Test it in your own mouth first. Seek mercy. You were a child yesterday and will be again when you are old. Remember this about other people. Stand last. Remember doors and look behind you." When the boy stopped reading, the little flame shook as if it had heard a thing worth hearing. Arthur nodded once, not miserly with praise but not throwing it like grain to chickens either. "You have begun," he said. "Most men never do. Is it too?" John began, searching for a word that did not know itself yet. "Simple," Arthur suggested. "Yes, good. All things that last are simple. It is the beginning that is hard, because men prefer to circle a fire and argue about the smoke. You have banked a coal. Tomorrow bring me a bucket of sand. We'll learn how to keep the spark when the wind wants it." They did. They spent an afternoon making small fires in the bitter yard, then putting them out without water, then starting them again with the driest grass and a flint. "Why not water?" John asked, chapped and happy. "Water is a river," Arthur said. "It runs away and asks you to fetch it again. Sand is patience. It may be slow to pour, but it never leaves you if you know where to look. One day, when you do not have what you think you need, you will be glad to have learned what was not impressive." Men came to Winterfell as men always come to such places, drawn by work, war, rumor, love, debt. Some brought bad habits. One brought a habit for cruelty that had grown fat in a place where no one had pressed it down. He was a Southron knight whose armor was better than his manners, whose laughter asked other men to laugh wrong. The yard watched him with the particular silence that hard ground makes in winter when horse hooves walk upon it. He took a disliking to the brown man because such men always do. He approached one evening when Arthur was binding a boy's sprained wrist, the bandage neat as a tidy farmer's field. The knight planted himself, metal bright, mouth wet. "Who taught you to hold a child's hand so tender?" he asked. His tone nodded with something that wanted to be teasing and wanted to be cruelty and had not chosen between them. "The child," Arthur said, not looking up. He finished the binding and blew on the knot to set it. "Go wash in hot water," he told the boy. "Not cold. Cold teaches a different lesson." "Answer when I speak to you, gray man," the knight said, some boredom in him looking for work to do. Arthur looked up then. His eyes were the color of old river ice. He saw a man who had aged too quickly in certain parts of his body and not at all in others. He saw the hunger for admiration that burns so bright it casts shadows 12 feet long. "There is a place in the yard for men to measure themselves," Arthur said. He stood and rolled his shoulders, as if loosening the clothesline before hanging a shirt. "But if you ask me to measure with you, you will be disappointed by what you learn." The knight huckled, a sound like a pewter cup scraped lightly with a knife. "They tell me you teach the Lord's bastard. Perhaps I will try my blade against his teacher, and if I cut him in half, the Lord will be forced to notice that men from the south do not always talk as much as he thinks." "No," Arthur said. The knight blinked. "No. No," Arthur repeated almost kindly. "We will not measure. You have too much to prove for me to be useful to you, and I have too much to lose that is not mine." Something in the knight's face darkened, the sudden storm that comes when a man senses that an audience might not be cooperative. He took half a step forward, then half a step back, a beast sniffing the fence. Eddard Stark had come to stand in the shadow of a pillar with that particular northern invisibility that is less a trick than a habit. The knight sensed him without seeing him and abandoned the path he had not quite decided to take. He laughed, loud now, and clapped Arthur on the shoulder, too hard, with the empty bonhomie of cowards. Later, when the sun had gone and the yard was a rectangle of frost, John came to Arthur where he sat mending a strap. "You could have cut him in pieces," John said, not entirely with admiration. "Why didn't you?" "Because he wanted me to," Arthur replied calmly, "and I have found it unwise to give men precisely the thing they want when the wanting is the point. He wanted to be seen. I saw him. I will see him until he is tired of himself." "What if he hurts someone?" John asked, bristling with the indignation of the unused blade. "Then we will stand where the blow lands," Arthur said softly, "and hold it with our bodies if we must. A sword is one kind of courage. There are others, and they are harder to sing about." He threaded the leather through the buckle, pulled, and felt the give that meant it would hold under strain. "Remember your 8. John spoke them, and the last word, stand last, came out like a small stone set where it should be, heavy, promising. In the weeks that followed, they built something that had no name. Arthur stopped thinking of it as training in the narrow way he had learned to name it in his own youth. He began to think of it as a marriage between the body and the day. He taught John to knead bread with a firm palm inside the kitchen while the women came and went around them, laughing at the boy and yet trusting him with their dough because he was careful. He taught him to muck a stall and to curry a horse until the animal gleamed, to oil a hinge so it stopped groaning like an old man. He taught him to sit with a dying dog for an hour without speaking in order to learn where the fear lived in the breaths. Knighthood, Arthur thought one morning, watching John lift a bucket as if it were a blade, has been too long about tournaments and songs. Let it be about how one man's sleep becomes another's wakefulness. Let it be about who rises when the crier is too hoarse to cry. Let it be about standing where someone is about to fall and making falling unnecessary. When John saw the first snow of the season blow across the yard and lay itself down in a thin film that turned every boot print into a word, he went quiet. The world had become something else. He knelt and touched the white sliver with 2 fingers. "It makes everything look like it belongs together," he said. "It does," Arthur answered. "And then it reminds you that everything under it is different. That is winter's business." It says in a very quiet voice, "Look how I can make this simple. But do not be fooled. Under my blanket are the shapes of the world, and you must know them when the blanket lifts." He stamped a heel to show the dark print it left. "We will learn to read this like a book." They went out into the fields with the kennel master and his pack. The dogs taught John to use his nose. "Rot," Arthur would say, "is not a single smell. It is a choir. Listen for the alto." John learned the smell of rabbit that had passed and of fox that had watched them from the hedge while they had their own foolish conversation. He learned to see the faint crescent of a hoof, the mark of a hare's foot with its soft trickery of direction. He learned that the world writes in many hands. The boy found a white runt among a litter, a pup who lay apart as if the air itself were a pillow it could not bear the weight of. Its eyes were pink-rimmed and the thin fur on its snout marked it pale as bone. The kennel master advised a mercy. "It will never be right," the man said gruffly, practical with the economy of people whose lives were made of cold and waiting. John scooped the pup up despite law and advice. It did not fight him. It lay against him like a quiet thought. Arthur watched them with a stillness that was as careful as prayer. He did not smile, but the corner of his mouth admitted once again that smiles exist. "Names are promises," Arthur said to John that night when they sat by the small hearth that John had built out in the yard to practice quick fires. The pup lay on John's feet as if claiming them. "Be careful when you pick one. Make sure you can pay what you owe it." John looked down at the small creature. "Ghost," he said finally, and his voice did not waver. "So you have promised to keep what you cannot hold," Arthur murmured. "Good. That is, sometimes, a man's business." They began to meet not only at dusk but very early, before the castle's dream had yawned itself out. Arthur took John to the godswood when even the ravens were thinking about whether they could be bothered to open their eyes. The old trees held the cold in their ribs. The weirwood's face watched without pity or contempt. John knelt in the snow and did not speak for a long time. Arthur stood with his fingers hidden in his sleeves, a monk of a god that had no priests, and listened to the boy's breath slow, deepen, grow steady. "This place is older than promise," Arthur said at last. "It does not care what you swear or to whom. It remembers sap and wind. But if you are quiet in it, it will make a space in you where you can hear what your life wants to be. Not what any man would use you for, not what your anger would shove you toward. What it wants to be. The work is hearing that once, and remembering it again for the rest of your days." John's eyes were open and as dark as the hole a vole makes in fresh snow. "I think it wants to be a door," he said, shy as if confessing to a fault. "Between warm and cold." "Then be that," Arthur said. "But a door must have hinges, and a keeper, and a hand that closes it and opens it. Learn those." He taught John to speak to men in ways that kept them whole. "Praise is a handful of salt," he said. Too much and a man cannot swallow anything else. Give him what he needs to cook with. Measure the rest. He had John practice telling a cook that a stew was oversalted. He had him practice telling a boy that his strike was poor. He had him practice telling a groom that a saddle's girth was threading loose. The boy's first attempts were clumsy and kind. His second were honest and hard. His third were plain and useful. He took John beyond the gates to the small village that lived in Winterfell's shadow. They brought bread and salve. They found a woman with her hands cracked to bleeding from the cold, whose husband had limped since a harvest gone wrong. Arthur knelt to rub salve into the woman's hands with a gentleness that made her eyes fill. John stood awkwardly until he knelt too, and did the other hand. "We are not lords," Arthur said quietly, so the woman would hear and also so John would. "We are men. Men put balm where the world has opened a skin." He taught the boy to listen to the way the woman looked at her man. The husband watched John the way a fox watches a hand that may throw something. "No one trusts the kindness of a rich house," Arthur said later, when they walked back to the gate. "And they are often right. Learn the difference between what helps and what only makes taking a bow easier." And always there was the blade. He taught John the plain cuts and the ways to turn a wrist without tearing the meat, the lifts that surprised a taller man, the little beats that ruined a big strike at the beginning before it had the chance to be anything. He taught the boy to recognize stupid bravery and clever fear. He taught him to sheath slowly even when the heart was hammering. He taught him to tie his wet hair back with a bit of leather that would break if someone grabbed it, rather than a strap that would hold and let a man be led like a horse. "Every choice is a bet," he said. "Do your betting where you can afford to lose." The Southron knight with the wet mouth tried again to find himself in the yard's afternoon air. He chose a smaller boy one day, the nephew of a tanner who had come to fix a saddle tree. The knight mocked him, brought the blade down too hard for any practice, and left a welt that rose while the boy tried not to let tears come out of his eyes. The yard went quiet. Eddard was away, riding his boundary. Men's mouths tightened, and their hands found their own hips to hold as if they could keep themselves from stepping forward by gripping their own bones. Arthur crossed the yard. He stood in front of the knight, 3 feet away, and said, "You strike at boys because they cannot strike you in a way that will teach you anything. That is the sound you make when you sleep too, I am sure. All that noise, and then the nothing a child hears while he lies awake." The knight smiled with all his teeth. "Will you measure now, brown man?" "No," Arthur said again. "I will not put steel in your hand. Put this instead." He held out a wooden ladle, long-handled and thick. The yard exhaled in astonishment and then held its breath again. The knight laughed, but not from the belly. He reached out, took the ladle, tried to make it a joke. Arthur did not smile. "You will strike at me with it," he said, "and I will show you why you needed a woman's spoon to teach you a lesson your master-at-arms forgot." The knight lunged, sudden and ugly, the way men do when they are used to applause. Arthur stepped just enough, no more, to let the swing pass, then tapped the knight's knuckles with 2 fingers, hard, in the place that makes a man's hand open unwillingly. The ladle dropped. The knight snarled and reached for his sword. "No," Arthur said. His voice was so soft and so certain that the knight's hand paused as if held by something other than sound. Arthur bent, picked up the ladle, and put it back in the knight's hand. Again, they danced. Arthur did not strike the knight's face or throat, though both were easy. He struck his wrist and his upper arm where the muscles would bruise, and the places under the ribs where a breath gets confused about whether it desires to stay or go. He moved at a speed that looked slow until one tried to match it. He never hit hard. He never hit where a scar would be noticed by anyone but a woman who loved and had reason to ask how it got there. The knight's laughter grew thin. Then it left entirely. Then his breath became the whole of his attention. The yard watched with the hungry relief of those who cannot afford to take sides aloud and must do so with their eyes. At last, when the lesson had written itself in enough places, Arthur stopped. He had not broken sweat. The knight stood, his lips pulled back from his teeth, chest rising and falling as if the cold were heavier than iron. Arthur looked at him as a teacher looks at a boy who has finally done a sum correctly. "Now," Arthur said quietly, "go to the tanner's sister and tell her you are sorry for striking the boy. Leave coin, not because it pays for what cannot be paid for, but because men must make their apology heavy enough to be carried home. Then come back and ask the boy if he will teach you the way to hold your long handle, because he does it better than you." The knight stared, incredulo. The yard's silence pressed on him like light. He went, stumbling a little, pride and fear and obedience wrestling inside him. He returned a half-hour later with a face that had been to a place inside itself he had not known. The boy showed him, shyly and then with pleasure, how to turn a long-handled thing in a hand without letting it twist. The tears the boy had refused came to him now, not because he was in pain but because he was being allowed to be proud. The knight put his big head down and tried to make his face into a place where the learning could rest. That night, Arthur sat on the outer wall and watched the cold stars right in the black space above him. He was not a man prone to prayer. He did not know whether anyone listened who could make sense of men's words. But he spoke into the dark anyway, not with a voice but with a precise and attentive quiet that made room for something he had never named. He thought of Starfall's waterfall, and the weight of dawn in his palms, and the slow smile of a boy who had invented his own little book in order to hold 8 ideas steady in his head. He thought of a white pup named for the thing that empties all rooms. He thought of Eddard's silence, the kind that widens what it touches instead of crushing it. He did not ask for forgiveness for what he had done. He did not ask for forgiveness for what he would do. He asked for the clarity to see a line where none wished to be drawn, and for the patience to stand beside it until a boy could see it too. He asked for winter's gift, the stripping away of ornament until only the bone remained, and a man could see whether it would bear his weight. Spring wrote itself in small hints, water at the edges of ice, a bird with opinions at the wrong hour, a woman shaking a rug with more vigor because the air had the idea of softness in it. John's shoulders had lost their boyishness in a way no one noticed until his shirt lay differently across them. He had learned to be still in the way that matters. When a horse shied, he did not fight it. He anchored himself and let the animal find him. When the Southron knight spoke to him again, weeks later, it was with an awkwardness that made a joke of itself. The man took his helmet off and held it to his chest the way a boy holds a pie he had not expected to receive. "You hit me with a spoon," he told John. "It was not a spoon, but that is what I will say when men ask me what I learned." John did not smile in the boy's way. He smiled in the way of a man who respects another's humility. Arthur watched and let pride be quiet. He had learned long ago that pride brings its own drums and does not need any more. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, he would go to the forge and watch the smith work. The blows here were loud and simple, and the iron clanged its complaint and transformed. The smith, Micken, would grunt and send him away if he stood too long without asking to hold something. Arthur would pick up tongs and the bellows and do as he was told, and on those days his sleep tasted of ash in a pleasant way. He studied iron and what it did when it was asked properly. Men were not iron. They were worse and better, but there is a lesson that moves from one thing to another if a man is gentle with it. There were nights when John came to him unasked with weary eyes. "I do not know where to put my anger," he said once, hands open, palms up, as if offering a weight no one could see. "It does not go into the snow like water. It stays. It makes me think about things I do not want to think about. It makes my face wrong." Arthur looked at him for a while in a silence that held the memory of other boys, other wrong faces, other weights. "We have learned where to put your breath," he said. "Now we will learn where to put your anger. It is not a debt to be paid. It is a tool to be stored. Put it in your thighs and your back. Carry it when you must lift a heavy thing. Put it in your strike when you must strike. Put it in the space between when you are tempted to speak and the word that comes. If you have nowhere to put it, set it down in the yard and let me watch it with you until it cools." John listened, his mouth set, his eyes wet and not ashamed. "What if it makes me cruel?" he asked. "It will try," Arthur said. "That is one of anger's hobbies. Your 8 things will keep it from its fun. Watch the way your lips want to pull back from your teeth. Listen to the way your voice changes key. Learn how much of it belongs to pride. Serve by putting it to work. Shield others when it is too hot by standing away. Speak truth about it to yourself. Seek mercy for yourself when you fail. And stand last, boy. Stand last when your anger is first to volunteer. They trained in the rain that smelled of earth, remembering how to be soft. They trained in winds so hard it made the blades song an argument. They trained in a thin mist that beaded on lashes and made every edge of the world reluctant. John's hands hardened where they needed to and stayed soft where they should. He learned to rest with intention. He learned to stop when he could still go on, because that is how you get to go on again tomorrow. Men in the hall began to notice. Men always notice when a boy begins to carry himself without explanation. Eddard watched the noticing and let it be. He spoke to Arthur only when there was a thing to be said that could not be carried by a look. "He laughs more easily," Eddard said once in a voice that made the observation into a reckoning. "He trusts his feet," Arthur answered. "Laughter is what feet do when they are not worried about the ground." "There will be invitations," Eddard said. "The South thinks it has recovered its appetite. Tournaments, hunts, a wedding feast that desires to be a banner above all other banners. My bannermen will go. They will expect me to send them boys hungry for admiration and wine. I will not send this one." Arthur nodded. "Let the world desire him without. Having him, it will keep its teeth sharp." "Once," Eddard said then, eyes on nothing visible, "I thought honor was a road. You set your foot upon it, and you went forward and backward by the compass of it. Now I think it is a hill. You must climb what others cannot see merely to be able to point to the place where they may walk." Arthur thought of a white sword in a dark chest and of a woman's laugh that had surprised her. "Honor is a table," he said softly. "What matters is what you put on it for other men to eat." The day the white raven came, the sky had the look of a body that has given up its secrets. The raven landed with the somber drama of its kind and stared with eyes like two bits of shiny flint. Its message told what the air already knew. Winter was called. The castle tightened as if a belt had been cinched one notch nearer the last. Arthur stood in the yard and watched snow begin to fall in a pretense of play that would become work as it always did. "Bread before steel," he told John, and they went to the stores with a dozen others and moved sacks until their backs had their say. He helped the bakers plan their days. How many loaves to bake so that the oven stayed hot enough to justify their hunger, and yet not so many that half would live to be wasted. He sent boys to collect wood not where the wood was easiest, but where the wind had left the driest sticks. He taught them to knock two pieces together and listen for the right sound before hauling. He taught them to stack with space for air. He taught them to count without making counting into a god. In the evening, John fell asleep on a bench with the white pup on his chest, both of them breathing with the slow seriousness of creatures trying to keep the warmth they have been given. Arthur covered them with a blanket, the wool scratchy and good-smelling. He stood there for a while as if guarding some king, though there was no crown to be seen. Beyond the walls, the land set its jaw. Men in halls far away raised cups and drank to the same white sky, thinking perhaps of war, or of glory, or of the long, sweet laziness of years in which nothing matters but the next song. Arthur thought of none of those. He thought of hinges. He thought of doors and whether they could hold. He thought of the 8 simple things that had begun to live in a boy like a set of bones one day will. He thought of other boys and girls, of men with wet mouths and men with dry ones, of women whose hands belonged to winter and to bread. He sat and sharpened his plain blade with a steady hand. He did not yearn for the pale sword left in its dark bed. He let the small, good sound of steel on stone be enough. He held the thing in his hand that work had made simple. He watched the snow take the world and make it beautiful and then, as it always does, ask to be shoveled. When the shovel came, he lifted it. And when dawn returned, it did not come as a sword, but as a thin, gray light that made everything once again look like it belonged together. He woke John gently, as one wakes a man who will be woken by trouble enough without his friends adding to it. The boy opened his eyes and smiled. The pup yawned a pink yawn. "There is much to be done," Arthur said in his brown man's voice, with the quiet that contains its own banners. "There is always much to be done." John sat up, fast as boys sit, and reached for his boots. He put them on as if putting on a day. He stood and stretched his long, still-growing arms. He said the 8 words, not as a prayer and not as a command, but as the acknowledgement of the weather inside him. He went out with Arthur into the cold. They met men with bad tempers and worse luck. They met a girl who could split kindling better than any boy in her row, and whose mother wanted it to be a secret until the day it could be a bread-winning truth. They met a boy who lied about having eaten because he could not stand to be seen as hungry. They met a widow whose chickens obeyed only words in a tongue no one else remembered. They met all the reasons a blade was a poorer answer than a hand. Arthur watched the boy meet them all. He stood where there were blows coming and let the boy know he was not alone. He corrected a wrist at the right moment. He stepped back when another lesson had to be learned with a bruise. He stepped in when a bruise would have become a bone. He taught and taught and taught until the teaching became another kind of breathing. And as the winter set, a slow rumor began under the snow, a whisper that men did not know they were making. It went from mouth to ear to mouth the way warm bread smell does in a hall. It said that a bastard in the north was learning a way that was not the south's way, and a brown man with quiet eyes had made a path without a name, and that perhaps, if the world had any sense left, the men who came after would walk it. It said that having a blade was less a matter of oil and polish and more a matter of where you set it when you bent to pick a child out of the mud. It would be a long time before anyone dared to call it a new age. Ages are made of breakfasts and bad nights, and the way a man decides between saying a cruel wit and a kind truth in the space of one breath. But something had begun, and the beginning was the only honest place to start. Snow fell and was shoveled, fell and was shoveled again. Bread rose and was eaten. Swords were lifted when needed and laid down when better work had called them. The boy learned to stand last when it mattered, and to stand first when it did not, because courtesy is sometimes a warrior's best deception. And in a room at Starfall where no one went unless they had a careful reason, a white sword slept in a dark box the way water sleeps between stones. It dreamed, perhaps as steel dreams, of light put through it like a thread, of the faces of men who had held it, of a boy's hand it had not yet known. Or perhaps it did not dream at all. Perhaps dreaming was N's business, and Steele's business was to be taken up when the hand that had earned it was ready. Arthur Dayne did not think of it most days. He thought of bread. He thought of the sound the snow makes when it surrenders. He thought of the boy, and how his feet had learned to find the ground all on their own. He thought sometimes of a woman whose voice had been a lantern. He tightened a strap, he tightened a line, he tightened the world where it had come loose. He drew a line on a day's page and stood with one boot on either side. He waited until the boy could stand there, too. And he said nothing about the age that men might one day say he had begun because names come late to the things that deserve them, and he had long since ceased to believe that the naming was the point. He paid attention instead to the small, steady work of teaching a boy where to put his breath. He watched the boy breathe, and in that simple, repeated act, he became more dangerous than any song could rightly sing.